A huge thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring today's video. Downloading better image quality and frame rate seems like it should be a myth, but you can actually do that with things like Optiscaler and Lossless Scaling, but you have to understand what are they actually doing. And when I made a video saying that Optiscaler might be the best PC gaming mod, I had a lot of people saying, well, what about Lossless Scaling? The honest answer is they're both cool. They both do awesome things. You don't need to have a favorite, and you probably should actually have both and understand when you should use each one. I also had a lot of people saying Optiscaler is only good on AMD GPUs. That is so much not the case. So how about we start on an RTX 3060, look at some use cases for NVIDIA users. We'll also look at AMD users benefiting from this, and also, again, the similarities, differences, pros and cons, and best use cases for Optiscaler as well as Lossless Scaling. So let's check this out. But first, when I test gaming performance on the channel, it is so exciting to find a game that actually runs like butter. War Thunder is not only the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made and is available now for free on PC, consoles, and mobile devices, but also extremely well optimized. Rather than push out some generic UE5 slop, War Thunder runs on the purpose-built and in-house developed Dagor engine, which is heavily optimized to deliver a lag-free experience with impressive visuals and high frame rates, even on lower-end machines. This is one of my favorite things about the game. But as a huge history fan, seriously, just for fun, I took enough upper division history classes in college for a degree in it if I had bothered with the second language requirement. I love that you can take command of over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships of 10 major nations, ranging from biplanes and armored cars of the 1920s to the fighter jets and main battle tanks of today. Join a worldwide community of over 70 million players in epic PvP battles today and delve into the breathtaking experience that is War Thunder. With an unmatched wealth of high-quality content to discover, there is simply no game better suited for fans of military history. So follow the link in the video description and play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, or mobile devices now. New and returning players on PC and consoles that haven't played in the last 6 months will also receive a massive bonus pack across all platforms that includes multiple premium vehicles, the exclusive vehicle decorator Eagle of Valor, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of premium account. It's available for a limited time only, so be quick. As we get started here, we should probably talk about there's a difference in how easy it is to get started with these apps. Lossless Scaling is available on Steam, super easy to get, but it has a bit of a paywall, $6.99. Optiscaler, on the other hand, is available on GitHub, and it's free, but GitHub can look a little more intimidating than Steam, and then you actually have to mod files into game files to get it going in the game that you want, and it's a little more complicated to actually get the thing going. Now, they, again, don't do quite the same thing, but there's some overlap. Let's go ahead and look at Lossless Scaling real quick, and then we'll look at how we would use a similar situation, but with Optiscaler. So how about we go into Final Fantasy VII Rebirth on an RTX 3060 on a 1440p display. I've already turned down to low graphics settings, but I'm only around 50 FPS, although I am still at native rendering resolution. So maybe I want a higher frame rate. So this is where we can open up the little Duck app on Steam, and we can select frame generation. LSFG 3.1 looks like currently the latest version. Fixed mode is just we can go like ×2, which would mean you should effectively double your frame rate. More on that in a second. And then I just click scale. There's also a keyboard shortcut you could use, and it'll count down. Make sure that before it counts down that you're focused in on the app that you want to generate frames in, and whoa, everything suddenly looked a lot smoother. But wait a second. My overall frame rate's reporting lower. Well, not so fast. So this is the frame rate the game is actually rendering at, and this is the number of frames that are being displayed on my monitor. Interesting. They don't match up. One's double the other. So again, Lossless Scaling is mostly used for frame generation. This does not make the game run faster, and it has its own performance overhead. Again, right now I'm getting about 40 actual frames rendered by the game. If I click Unscale again and look at this scene, we're at about 50 or 51 actual frames rendered by the game. So by using this, your game does become slightly less responsive, and we can also talk about some image quality issues. However, it really does make things a lot more motion fluidity. You're watching a 60 FPS fixed frame rate YouTube video, so I don't know how much this is coming through to you, but there really is an improvement to motion fluidity on the screen when this kicks on. However, again, there is that bit of a trade-off. Now, another thing you may note, though, is there can also be some image quality artifacts. If you look specifically at things like Cloud's arms as they're swinging, stuff like that, or as, you know, if I kind of spin the camera around here, there's a bit of a weird warbliness around Cloud. Then there, you know, that's some image quality artifacts from the frame generation process, which is what this is doing. So all lossless scaling is really doing here is basically taking every 2 frames your game is rendering, slightly delaying showing you one, and then making a guess at what's happening in between and inserting that and then displaying them. So you get more frames on your display, so it looks smoother, but at the same time, you are actually making the game a bit less responsive and adding in its own image quality issues due to the incorrect guessing of what happens in the in between those frames. So that's, in a nutshell, what lossless scaling does. However, there are a few other cool things we could look at here before we compare using Optiscaler in this game. So a couple of things. One thing we should mention is that there is actually a version of this called performance mode. So let's unscale for a second and actually kick performance mode on, and then we'll scale. So again, we're at the kind of 50 FPS baseline before kicking it on. Now let's kick on lossless scaling using performance mode. Remember that using the standard mode, the non-performance mode, we dropped around 40 FPS when it kicked on. This one is, well, at first dropping down to around 40, 41 now. So yeah, I'm not seeing a massive improvement to the performance on that, but some people have reported pretty good results. Just thought I would kind of throw that out there as a bit of a option. But there is also this flow scale. Now this seems to be adjusting kind of the resolution of the generated frames, and I think by turning this down, you're able to get some additional performance. You're effectively lowering the frame generation cost. Let me go ahead and click the unscale and then rescale it to see if that makes any sort of a difference. But again, by lowering those effects, it should be reducing the overall burden on the overall process, but still there is, no matter what we do, going to be some amount of frame time cost on that, and doing all of those things is decreasing the quality of the generated frames. Now, in my opinion, one of the best things you can do with lossless scaling to make it work well is try to achieve a high enough base frame rate before you actually kick it on. I would like it to, after kicking it on, actually still be above 60 FPS and doubling it to around 120. So I'm gonna go ahead and go back to this, the standard mode, but we're gonna unscale, and what we're actually gonna do is try to adjust the game to better settings from which to use this. Now I understand depending on your PC specs and what game you're playing, you might not be able to get a super high base frame rate, but I think it's preferable if you can. So here, I'm gonna go ahead and use DLSS upscaling to lower the internal rendering resolution of the game, try to output something that looks kind of like 1440p. It's not gonna be perfect, but I was already at the low graphics settings, right? So what we can see now is without frame generation, that my overall base frame rate is over 80 now, sometimes in the 90s. Let's go ahead and look. Okay, so we're at about 84 before kicking on lossless scaling. Now let's go ahead and do the ×2 mode again, and we can see that while it will still have that performance drop when it kicks in, it's not going to be down to super low. Hey, look, we're actually closer to 60 FPS now when we kick that on. Now, it's still not amazingly high, and we are losing real rendered frames in order to use this. That's important to know. But the higher the base frame rate is from which you're using it, I think the less image quality artifacts I notice and the more responsive the game still manages to feel when we're doing this. So I do think that that is helpful. Another thing that can be useful is actually implementing a frame rate cap from which you don't go over to get a more consistent experience. So if you can find the kind of frame rate level that you tend to stay at, you can try to cap to around that level. Now it doesn't look like we can maintain a 60 FPS lock at these settings, which would have been nice, but just to kind of give you the idea of what I'm talking about, if you kick it to a 30 FPS lock, or maybe you're playing a game that is always locked to 30, you can get a nice consistent base frame rate from which to use it. But ooh, now you're really seeing probably the image quality break apart a little bit around cloud, for example. Now that we have the 30 FPS baseline, you can really start to see the cracks in the image quality. So lossless scaling is definitely best the higher the base frame rate is. But that's true of all scaling technology, frame generation technologies. And Optiscaler, when we use it for frame generation, which is not the only thing it can be used for, is going to be no different on that. So anyway, there are some differences though, because what this is effectively doing is just capturing the output of the game. It's not integrated into the game in any way. And then it is, like I said, generating frames in between. Now, Optiscaler is going to be something different. Let's take a look at how we would use that for frame generation, but then also as an upscaler. All right, let's talk about Optiscaler for a second, because it really does a different thing. Lossless scaling was just basically any game, or honestly, you could even use it on YouTube videos and whatnot. You click scale, it generates frames, you get more motion fluidity, there are some image quality artifacts, etc. But it's not directly integrating into the game, which can have some image quality issues, but it is really easy to use. Now, Optiscaler is a little bit different. Optiscaler is actually going to be added to the game files and will be directly integrating into the game. It can be used to add in frame generation by taking a game that doesn't have frame generation support and actually adding in, as far as I can tell, FSR frame generation, which does work on NVIDIA GPUs, even 20 and 30 series GPUs, or even 10 series GPUs that don't have DLSS frame generation support. And you can use this in games that don't have frame generation support, like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, for example. But it will be the FSR version of frame generation, but you could still use it with DLSS upscaling if you want to. This is why it can be very useful for NVIDIA users. But this does more than that. Also, because this is directly kind of capturing the game files, if a game has DLSS support but not FSR support, you can capture the DLSS inputs, run it through Optiscaler, and make it have FSR support or XeSS support, or add in FSR 4 into games that just have DLSS. But this can also be used to do vice versa. There are some games that only have FSR and not DLSS, and you can capture FSR and add in DLSS. It's pretty cool, and I'm talking about the upscalers there. It's kind of annoying that FSR and DLSS frame generation is kind of under the same branding as their upscaling, because those are doing different things, but whatever. Anyway, I can also do some things like trying to take NVIDIA's Reflex and add in other compatible technologies to reduce the latency as you're using things. So this is pretty cool, and it integrates directly into the game, which can have some benefits, but also makes it a little bit more complicated to use. So the next thing we need to do is install it. Now the good thing is that if you're at the GitHub, and I'll try to put a link in the video description, there is pretty good explanation of how to do this, and I'll take you through this process right here. The first step is to download the latest version of Optiscaler from GitHub. You can find the releases right here. You can click on that, and you want to go ahead and download the latest version. Optiscaler here, your version number may vary if newer versions are out by the time you're watching this. You'd go ahead and download that, and you can open up the file where that is located. Now, Optiscaler is a little harder to get working initially. Once you have it in the game, it's not hard, but initially than Lossless Scaling. So once we've downloaded it, you have to actually insert it into the game files. It's not just a little duck app that you can run on any game, click scale, and it's done. But it will be more directly integrated in the game, which gives it some advantages. Anyway, so there's some good instructions on the GitHub for this, but I'll kind of walk you through that process in case it feels a little overwhelming, depending on your comfort level with, all this file navigating and copying and stuff. So basically, we take the zip file and we need to extract it into the main game file for the game we want to play. Let me show you the example with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. So I bought that game on Steam, so I'm going to need to go to where my Steam games are saved to. So if you're on a PC with multiple hard drives that you use, etc., this could look a little different, but the default would be local disk C, program files x86, and then Steam, Open up that. Inside Steam, you will see Steam Apps. Open up that. And then inside that file, you will see Common. Open up Common. Then you should see a bunch of Steam games. If you've changed where your Steam games are saved to, go to wherever you have them saved. Now, I want to open up the game I want to use this on, which is Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. And here's where you could fall into a trap, because generally what you want to do is you want to extract the Optiscaler files to wherever that is located, the main game application. However, they do have a warning on the GitHub that for Unreal Engine games, and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is Unreal Engine 4, it says you're looking for the exe file in one of the subfolders, not the one that pops up right here. They say that you ignore the engine folder. So for example, here I'm going to open up the end folder. Then I'm going to follow the instructions they have right here, which is to go to binaries. So we'll do that next, then Win64. And then in here, I do see another Final Fantasy VII application file. This is the one we want. What we want to do is extract the Optiscaler file to here. Now, there's a few ways you could do that. One is if you're going to extract all, you then need to find the right location. You can browse all of the stuff that I just said. Another option that might be easier for some people is I could copy this into this location, and then I can click right-click, extract all. But here, there is one little detail that could mess you up, which is I don't want to extract into another copy of the Optiscaler folder. I want it to be directly in that Win64. So I'm going to delete everything except for that Win64 bit here. Again, otherwise you could have just done extract all and gone through this process to get to this game folder. Either way, we want to be extracting it. I've already done this before. I removed most of the files. It's finding some that were already there. You might not see this copy and replace. I'm going to go ahead and copy and replace anything that was already there. I guess I failed to completely remove Optiscaler on this PC. Anyway, so you might not have to click those copy and replace buttons. But anyway, now you see some folders, some files, I should say, in this folder location. Now, the next one that we're looking for, again, we're just following the instructions right here, is step 2. Run the Optiscaler setup.bat script to try to do the automated process. This should work in most games, but Optiscaler, I should note, isn't compatible with every game, and some games might have more of a manual process. But this should generally work in most situations. So I'm looking for this Optiscaler setup Windows batch file. I'm going to double-click that. We do have to agree that we trust what this is doing, so, you know, this is an app a lot of people use. The source code is available on GitHub, but again, always, you know, make sure you're comfortable doing this type of thing. I'm going to go ahead and run anyway, and then you can choose a name for the file. You could also just press enter for a default. That's what I'm going to do. Then it asks, am I using an NVIDIA GPU or an AMD or Intel GPU? I'm using a NVIDIA GPU currently, so I'm going to press number 2. Then I'm going to press enter. And it now says enjoy. Obviously, you're using AMD or Intel, you would push the corresponding button. I'm going to click enter. Now, there is a note here that for AMD or Intel users about using DLSS inputs, it's necessary to select yes if you intend to use Nukem mod, etc. So there's a few potential additional things you might want to look into if you are an AMD or Intel user. Shouldn't be too much different or too complicated. Again, the instructions are right here on GitHub. With Optiscaler installed, the way you actually open it in a game is you press the insert key. I think you can probably change that as a default, but I'm just going to go ahead and leave it with that. Now, this opens up what can look like a kind of intimidating menu. Now, if you're an NVIDIA user, the most likely thing you might be doing with this is actually using it to kick on frame generation. If you're an AMD user, the most likely thing you might be doing with it is to convert the upscaler from DLSS into FSR, which I've covered more in my previous video about Optiscaler, so that's not going to be the main thing I'm focusing on here. In that video, people challenged me to what would this even be useful for an NVIDIA user? Well, check it out. We now have a frame generation option. So I can now click on OptiFG, and we now should have some frame generation. Now, it does say I need to save any and restart to apply the changes. There's a Save Any button down here. I'm going to click that, and then we will restart the game. All right, so I've restarted the game. I'm gonna press Insert, and now notice that I have some frame generation options. So if I want to turn on frame generation, it's as simple as clicking FG Active. And notice that after a brief second, our frame rate number in the top left corner has gone up. It's at about 82, which in ×2 frame generation mode means that our base frame rate's about 41 now. In other words, it's very similar performance level as far as that cost as what we were getting when we were using the lossless scaling frame generation. But there could be some quality differences because this is actually being directly integrated into the game. It should have access to game information like motion vectors that a frame generation being applied to the output image like lossless scaling doesn't have. That being said, one might work better than the other on a game-by-game basis. Now, another thing you might want to use here is FG HUD Fix. In some games, this will correct some graphical issues with HUD elements, so we could go ahead and click that on. And then there's also Allow Async. Now, this says that enable async for better FG performance might cause crashes, especially with HUD Fix. So if you're getting crashes, you might not want to have all of these clicked. I'm going to try clicking all of them, and actually it looks like my game just crashed. So that's interesting. Let me attempt to restart. All right, I'm back into the game, and this time we'll just try FG Active with the HUD Fix. Now, why would I definitely want the HUD Fix? Well, let's actually try it for a second without the HUD Fix, and I'll show you what I've noticed off camera. So first of all, let's try this out. Now, I can say that to my eye, I feel like there's less warbly, ghosty stuff around cloud. Now, that doesn't say there's none. This is still frame generation. It's still guessing what's happening between two frames, and it can make mistakes. However, this is integrated directly into the game, so it does have access to motion vectors and things that do make it easier to guess what is happening in between those two frames that the lossless scaling doesn't have access to. Maybe in a minute we can flip back and forth between the two, but anyway, it is getting the job done, which is nice. However, I did notice that when I went to this menu, let's see if it does it again this time, I was getting some weird graphical glitching behind cloud. Let's see if it happens again this time. Maybe it's not going to do it for me this time, but I had been noticing some weird graphical glitching on this menu. Which, okay, interesting. Maybe it's just not going to do it to me, so it's fine. But the point is you can try the HUD Fix button, and perhaps it will fix some issues if you're seeing them. I did see some. Actually, ooh, I just noticed my mini-map. Guys, look at the mini-map right now, top right-hand corner of the screen. That is glitching pretty crazy. Let's go ahead and see if the HUD Fix fixes that. Okay, so I've clicked the HUD Fix, hit Insert again, that's gone. Ooh, looks like we are still having some problems with that, despite HUD Fix being enabled. Let's see if, would it help to turn it all on and off again? Probably not, but I figured I'd try. Ooh, and we are actually getting a crash again when I just enabled it. And that's one thing I have noticed, is that Optiscaler has triggered crashes. In some games it's very stable, others it's less so. So I'm gonna go ahead and restart that again. All right, I'm back into the game, and you know what? So I've been trying this a couple of times. I can't get the HUD Fix to always stay working, and also, again, when I try to use the Optiscaler frame gen in here, you can see that the mini-map in the top right is just absolutely going nuts. So in some games, the Optiscaler frame generation is going to look better and be more HUD aware and things like that than lossless scaling is. However, in this particular game, it's seeming like that isn't the case. Let's actually try that out here with lossless scaling because I think this is going to go ahead and look better. So as that goes ahead and kicks in, we should see it kick in. I'm getting more motion fluidity, lower base frame rate, but more generated frames, and the mini-map is actually looking pretty solid here. So should we come to any sort of a conclusion in this video right now? Does one of these apps need to be the best? Well, they have pros and cons. As we can see here, in this particular situation, lossless scaling is handling the HUD elements here, like that mini-map, better than Optiscaler is, despite the fact that it's not directly integrated into the game. But there are going to be other games where you'll probably prefer the frame generation from Optiscaler and its advantages that it is integrated into the game. And I do think that some other elements to the image are actually a little bit better using the Optiscaler one. For example, with Lossless Scaling, I do think that the weird ghostiness around Cloud himself, the cloudiness around Cloud as he moves, might be a little bit worse with the Lossless Scaling situation. Also, what I'm really trying to get at, though, is that you can use both of these, and they both have other use cases. For example, with Optiscaler, I could, like I said, if I was in a game that only had FSR support, I could add in DLSS. Or more commonly, if you're an AMD user, if you're in a game that only has DLSS support, you can switch over to using FSR. And if you're on an RDNA 4 GPU that has FSR 4 support, you can get FSR 4 into a bunch of games that don't already have that. I have another game where I focused more on, another video where I focused more on that. So we don't necessarily need to go into the weeds on that in this video, but it is super useful for RDNA 4 users. But like I said, this is also useful here for NVIDIA users as well, because it can, like I said, add in frame generation to games that don't already have it. You can get more additional control over DLSS. For example, we can even hit some dynamic resolution scaling targets where we hit certain frame rates. There's a lot of interesting stuff here that I didn't fully dive into all of the details in this video. So I think Optiscaler can be useful for just about everybody, and you could combine the resolution scaling pieces of Optiscaler with lossless scaling. There's no reason you can't use them at the same time. You don't need to pick which app is better. I highly recommend people have both. Also, lossless scaling can do some other little things that I didn't really focus on here, so I'll just mention some stuff quickly. One thing it can do is it does have its own upscaling stuff, but I would not use these instead of Optiscaler for most modern gaming situations. Optiscaler has much better options with modern versions of DLSS and FSR and XeSS that need to be directly integrated into games to function. Lossless scaling has things like FSR1 or LS1, which are just spatial upscalers. They don't work as well. However, if you are instead playing like older pixel art type games and emulators and things like that, there could be use cases for some of these like nearest neighbor, integer scaling, sharp bilinear, etc., which is actually what lossless scaling originally was. It wasn't originally a frame generation app, which is why it's called lossless scaling. It's just had others things added into it where frame generation, I think, kind of took off as the more popular feature. So that's worth noting. Also worth noting the fact that right now I'm just showing ×2 frame generation, but heck, this can go all the way up to ×3, ×4, ×5, ×6, ×20 even, I think is the limit. But here's the thing, if I go up to ×20 mode, first of all, the image quality looks awful now because there's so much overhead on this. You can see that my base frame rate is all the way down to 15. Now that being said, we're outputting almost 300 frames per second, but the latency is just awful now, and the image quality is not good. So I wouldn't really use it for this, but it's kind of cool that it can do it. Another kind of neat thing about lossless scaling is that it can do how should we put it? So they call it an adaptive mode. So in adaptive mode, you don't do I want ×2 or ×3 or ×4. You just say I would like to hit a certain frame rate. Let's say I want to hit 60 frames per second. And then I just let it hit 60 frames per second. And it is hitting 60 frames per second. But this is weird because my base frame rate is like 38-ish, but then it's generating up to 60. How could that possibly not be an even multiple? Well, my understanding of this is that we're probably not seeing any of the actual rendered frames. What we're probably seeing here is just generated frames that are then time-stamped and scaled to the appropriate output timing to hit that 60 FPS. So it's not showing generated frames in between the rendered frames, which is where you need those fixed multiples for it to work out nicely. It's doing something that I think maybe AMD and NVIDIA might eventually get to, but haven't yet, which is maybe abandon showing the rendered frames entirely just to hit your monitor's max refresh rate. Now, I don't think that this is the best way to use this because, well, for a variety of reasons we don't need to get into. One of them is I think we are seeing fewer rendered frames. But I do actually think that this might be the future of frame generation technology in the long run, is essentially you just click a button and you've maxed out your monitor's refresh rate, and it just did whatever it had to do to get there. I think as quality increases, that could be a cool thing, but lossless scaling does have that downside of it is working on top of the game. It is not integrated into it. So while they have done, honestly, an extremely impressive job of improving the quality over time, I do think it will always inherently have a disadvantage compared to frame generation techniques that are integrated directly into the game. Doesn't mean it's always worse, because sometimes those have their own issues too, but it's always working from a disadvantage in those cases. All right, hopefully you guys found the video useful and or interesting. Like I said, I've already did one a little more focused on the AMD use case, especially getting FSR4 into games and all of that. And hopefully the takeaway is both of these apps are really cool and they have their pros and cons, but honestly can even be used at the same time. It's not necessarily one is better, although one is sometimes better for certain situations in certain games. I hope all of you have an excellent day. And don't forget to follow the link in the video description and play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, or mobile devices now. New and returning players on PC and consoles that haven't played in the last 6 months will also receive a massive bonus pack across all platforms that includes multiple premium vehicles, the exclusive vehicle decorator Eagle of Valor, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of premium account. It's available for a limited time only, so be quick.